assess that? Because there were a lot of concerns before Trump had been elected, but now we do even hear the talks about, providing lethal defense weapon, which was not there.
Well, I hope that the administration decides to provide defensive weapons to Ukraine. I think it's unlikely, given the fact that Mr. Trump has coddled Mr. Putin throughout his time in office and during the campaign. He has cozied up to him. He has never really criticized Mr. Putin for his aggression in Ukraine or for his interference in our election here in the United States. So I'm very skeptical that this will come about. I hope it does. I think the problem with this administration with regards to Ukraine is that there is benign or perhaps not so benign neglect. So there is not pressure on the government to comply with anti-corruption norms. There is not an overriding pressure from the administration to push the government to undertake further economic reforms, agricultural reforms, tax and administrative reforms. So my sense is that we're in this sort of uneasy status quo for the time being.
Why do you think these things critical if you speak about anti-corruption? There are people who prefer to separate us, that, there is a Russian threat and the real Ukrainian problem.
I think that's a false dichotomy. I think that the threat of corruption in Ukraine is just as important as the threat in the Donbass, and in many ways they're interwoven. And so unless Ukraine is able to defend itself against corruption, this provides an avenue for Russia to interfere in the political process and to subvert Ukraine over the long run. So it really requires that both the Ukrainian government but also the international community focus on both and press for progress on both. There's not going to be progress in the Donbass without progress on corruption.
And now there are a lot of talks about the providing defense lethal weapon. The General Mattis, while coming to Kiev, mentioned that. But what can you say about the probability of that? And also why you were advising Joe Biden, you were working for the previous administration, why then it hadn't happened?
Well, there were a number of us in the previous administration that argued very forcefully in favor of providing Ukraine with defensive weapons. And the reasons why we did so is because we wanted to prevent Russia from having more tools, more options for being able to conduct attacks across the line of contact. I am glad that currently Secretary Mattis, and if I understand correctly, National Security Advisor McMaster and Secretary Tillerson are all supportive of defensive weapons. But as I said at the outset, I'm very skeptical that the administration is going to decide to do this, simply because Mr. Trump is too cozy with the Russians to see this as something that would benefit him personally.
Yet, what kind of the support could Ukraine either expect or could be useful at this stage? Because usually, of course, there are a lot of talk that still US will support Ukraine, but what exactly would be effective at this stage?
Well, I think effective in the first instance would be continuing the training program for the Ukrainian military. That has been transformative in terms of increasing the readiness of the troops. And so keeping the training program that is currently going active and also expanding it to do combined arms training, I think would have a huge impact. I do think that providing certain types of defensive weapons, like especially anti-tank systems, would be very effective in deterring or at least disincentivizing Russian attacks across the line of contact. And then there's other programs, I think, supporting the Ukrainian Navy, providing perhaps some limited mobile air defense systems. Those could all be useful in deterring further Russian aggression.
You worked for Vice President Biden, and it's not just about what you were talking. We heard about his unique role in the issues like, for instance, talking about the former Prosecutor General Shocking. It's not just you who said that, but we knew that there was a really strong pressure, particularly from him, on fighting corruption in Ukraine. So can you elaborate more on that? Why and to what extent Vice President had been involved? What
Well,
was his role?
Vice President Biden was very strong in his advocacy for pushing anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine. He met many times with anti-corruption advocates and anti-corruption NGOs. He really raised this issue almost every single time he spoke with either President Poroshenko or Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, or later with Prime Minister Groisman. This was the core of his message to the Ukrainian authorities: was, we will help you to confront Russian aggression in the Donbass, but you have to take this issue of corruption seriously, because this is as great a threat to your sovereignty as anything else. And so he really was very passionate about the issue, and I think rightfully so. I think this is one of the existential issues for Ukraine, because it's not just about the economy and economic growth. It's about national security, and it's fundamentally about the country's sovereignty, because right now Russia sees corruption as the best opportunity to destabilize Ukraine and to subvert its sovereignty. So unless the government gets serious about pushing the reforms forward, Russia will have an easy way to undermine Ukraine, and that would be a tragedy.
What are the concerns? What were the major concerns in particular, maybe in details, and what are today for you as well?
Well, I think the major concerns are having a credible set of institutions that can prosecute corruption. It is absolutely a travesty that this many years after the Revolution of Dignity, that there are no high-level prosecutions of political actors for corruption. I think, having the new institutions in place is great. Having the NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and the Office for the Prevention of Corruption, that is a good step forward. But until anti-corruption courts are in place, until we start to see actual prosecutions of officials for corruption, then what are we talking about? Then this is all a charade. Then there's just simply institutions that are not actually carrying out what it is that they're supposed to be doing.